The spell card Super Polymerization allows you to use your opponent's monsters in order to go into a fusion monster for yourself, and since it can be used during either player's turn, and the card can't be negated through normal means, it makes it an excellent card to get rid of problem boss monsters. So in this list, we'll go over 10 of the best cards you can have in your extra deck to be prepared against almost any deck. And at number 10, we have Nethersoul Dragon. This card can be fusion summoned with any 2 zombie monsters, which at first glance makes this card seem like a terrible super poly target, as it would be entirely dependent on your opponent playing zombie type monsters. However, if you're playing the field spell card Zombie World, it changes all of your opponent's monsters into zombies, which turns your super poly and a Dragonecro in your extra deck into a removal of any 2 of your opponent's monsters, as a lot of monsters who have protection from destruction or being targeted can still be used as fusion materials, so Super Poly can pick them off the field. Although this card is entirely reliant on playing Zombie World, which some zombie decks do, Zombie World has one of the best field searchers in the game in the form of Necroworld Banshee, who can search Zombie World from your deck from the graveyard. And being able to take any 2 monsters from your opponent if you're playing Zombie World is pretty great, especially since Dragonecro himself is actually pretty good, as it can crash into a monster in order to reduce their attack to 0, and then summon a token who has that monster's stats, but it can't actually destroy monsters by battle. So think of its effect as attacking into a monster to then convert that monster's attack into a token for yourself. Although this effect only works on monsters that have a level, so Link and Xyz monsters are immune to this effect. Although since this card does require you to play Zombie World in order for it to be useful outside of a very niche matchup where you know your opponent is playing zombie monsters, this card only gets the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Chimera. This is a level 5 fusion monster which requires 2 Cyberse monsters as materials. Now, this card is very similar to Dragonecro in that it requires 2 specific types of monsters as its fusion materials. Although, unlike Dragonecro, Cyberse types are incredibly common in a vast majority of decks. Because of one little interesting fact, about 30% of Link monsters are Cyberse type, which would give Cyberse the majority when it comes to Link monster types, which means a lot of the generic and heavily used ones at that. So if your opponent has a whole bunch of Link monsters on their side of the field, there's a good chance 2 of them might be Cyberse type, and you'll be able to pull out a Chimera with a Super Polymerization. Although it's not something to super count on, and it's not as live of a target as some of the higher spots in this list, so it only barely makes it above something like Dragonecro, since it doesn't really require a field spell card for it to be useful. And at number 8, we have Salamangreat Violet Chimera. This is a Cyberse type fusion monster, whose materials are 1 Salamangreat monster plus any 1 Link monster. So if you have this card in your extra deck, and you're playing against a Salamangreat deck, you'll be able to use Super Polymerization basically anytime your opponent has a board set up. Now I know this one is much more specific than the previous 2 spots, but the reason this card sees so much more play is because Salamangreats are kind of good, and they're more heavily played. And when they're more heavily played, this card gets more heavily played in non-Salamangreat decks as a super poly target. Now this card also has some effects as well, though they aren't super important because this card is basically just used as a super poly target. But while on the field, this card will also gain an attack boost equal to half the original attack of the monster used for its fusion summon until the end phase, and it can also increase and decrease attacks during the battle phase depending on some other circumstances. Its effect isn't super great, but its materials make this card heavily played, even more so than Chimera. And at number 7, we have Invoked Elysium. This card's materials are 1 invoked monster plus any 1 monster that was special summoned from the extra deck. Now, with invoked decks seeing a lot more play recently, like in the past year, this card is a lot more live of a super poly target than it used to be, especially after the Master Rule revisions, which allows you to play fusion monsters and invoked decks more easily, as invoked decks are all about bringing out fusion monsters like crazy, more specifically invoked Makaba, and having an invoked Elysium ready with the Super Polymerization is great for getting rid of that card, especially since that card can negate effects, but not Super Polymerization. And since the materials for this card are just any invoked monster plus any monster that's special summoned from the extra deck, you can turn any of your opponent's other fusion, Xyz, Synchro, Link, or even Pendulum monsters into its other material. Which is kind of funny, because when invoked cards first came out, this was one of the least played of all the invoked fusion monsters, and that's because Super Polymerization was still banned when this card first came out. And now that there's more of a resurgence of invoked cards again, Invoked Elysium is now seeing a ton of play in other non-invoked decks, so they can counter them with their copies of Super Polymerization. But since this card is very specific to countering one archetype, it gets kind of a low spot on this list, but since that specific archetype is splashed into a whole bunch of other archetypes, it makes it at a high spot on this list, as being the best archetype-specific Super Poly target. And at number 6, we have Predaplant Triphyoverutum. This card's materials are just 3 dark monsters, and dark monsters are the best attribute in the game. And there's tons of heavily played cards which are dark attribute. So being able to pick out 3 of them from your opponent to bring this card out is a great play that can probably win you the game on its own, especially since this card also has a really good effect, where if your opponent special summons a monster from their extra deck, you can negate that summon and then destroy that card once per turn. It basically gives you a single Solemn Warning effect per turn, which is super good, especially if you can use this card after taking out 3 of your opponent's monsters. It also has another effect that allows it to special summon itself from the graveyard if you have a predator counter on the field, which is probably something you won't be using outside of the Predaplant archetype, but its negate summon effect is super good, which makes this an excellent Super Polymerization target, which is only hampered by the fact that it does require 3 monsters, so there is a chance you won't be able to bring this card out, which makes the higher spots a little bit better. And at number 5, we have World Chalice Guardragon Almarduke. This card has 2 ways to bring itself out of the extra deck. You can either tribute 3 link monsters you control to special summon this card without a Polymerization type card, or you can bring this card out the old-fashioned way by using 3 link monsters on the field as fusion materials with your Super Polymerization or other fusion spell card. And since the materials for this card are just any 3 link monsters, even after the Master Rule revisions, link monsters are still used because they're pretty good. And if your opponent has a whole board of established cards, there's a good chance you'll be able to steal 3 of your opponent's cards to bring this one out. Which, just like the previous spot on this list, getting rid of 3 of your opponent's monsters who might have had negates and indestructible effects is pretty good. Although Almarduke's effect is not as good as Predaplant Triph, its effect is it allows you to attack all your opponent's monsters once each, and if it's battling a link monster, it allows you to banish a link monster with the same link rating as that card from your field or graveyard in order to destroy that monster without damage calculation and inflict burn damage to your opponent equal to that monster's original attack. Which is alright, but it's nowhere near as good as negating a special summon once per turn. Although being able to target 3 link monsters is a little bit more live than targeting 3 dark attribute monsters, which gives it a slightly higher spot on this list. And at number 4, we have another Predaplant fusion monster, Predaplant Dragostapelia. This card's materials are just 1 fusion monster plus any 1 dark monster, and with how popular the invoked engines are, which heavily use fusion monsters, and with how popular Super Polymerization is, this card has a lot of live fusion monsters it can use as a fusion material, in addition to the fact that dark monsters make up the majority of used monsters in the metagame. This card was even more valuable back in the Thunder Dragon era, before Thunder Dragon Colossus was banned, as that deck loved to use fusion monsters and dark fusion monsters. So this card was like the anti-Thunder Dragon Super Poly target. And in addition to having 2 great materials, it also had a really good effect, where it was a quick effect that allowed you to place a predator counter on one of your opponent's monsters, which will then reduce the monster's level to 1, and negate the activated effects of all of your opponent's monsters that have predator counters on them. So basically, this card had a quick effect to negate a monster effect, and then that predator counter can be used to revive Predaplant Triph from your graveyard if you manage to get that card out earlier, which is a super niche interaction, but it's definitely possible since these are both good Super Poly targets. So for having pretty good fusion materials, and surprisingly having a good effect as well, it's no wonder Predaplant Dragostapelia sees tons of play. And at number 3, we have Eartha Golem Ignister. This card's materials are 1 Cyberse monster plus any 1 link monster. Now, like I said a little bit earlier, 30% of link monsters are Cyberse type, and a lot of the good link monsters are Cyberse as well. Plus, lots of people like to just use regular link monsters in their combos. So because this card exists with its materials, there's really no reason to play Diplexer Chimera anymore, because Eartha Golem Ignister is just so much more versatile in its materials. If your opponent has a Trigade Wizard and an Apollousa Bow of the Goddess, you can use a single Super Poly to get rid of both of those cards, if you have Earth Golem Ignister in your extra deck. And those are both very good monsters with negates that can't stop Super Poly. Now, this card also has some effects to it. You take no damage for the rest of the turn after this card is fusion summoned. If it attacks a monster from the extra deck, it can gain attack equal to its original attack, so 2300. And if this card is destroyed by battle, you get to special summon a Cyberse monster from your graveyard, except this card. So it has some pretty decent battle damage effects, although you don't really play this card because of its battle phase effects. This card is 100% heavily played because it has great Super Poly fusion materials, and is only slightly used less than the first two spots on this list, and that's mainly because it came out so recently in the TCG. And at number 2, we have Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. This card's materials are any 2 dark monsters on the field except tokens, which makes it a perfect Super Poly target. Now, for the same reason Predaplant Triphyoverutum is played, the fact that there's a lot of dark attribute monsters in the meta, Starving Venom Fusion Dragon is better since it only requires 2 of them, so it's just easier to use, and will be live much more often. In addition, this card also has good effects, where if this card is destroyed, you get to destroy all of your opponent's special summon monsters, which is an excellent floating effect on a monster that was probably used to get rid of 2 of your opponent's monsters in the first place. It's just full advantage for destroying your opponent's monsters. It also has 2 other effects. One of them allows it to gain attack equal to one of your opponent's special summon monsters when it's fusion summoned until the end of the turn. So it has the potential to be a huge beat stick the turn it comes out to do damage right away. And it also has another, more niche effect, where once per turn you can target one of your opponent's level 5 or higher monsters in order to copy that monster's name and effect for the turn. So if you use this card to copy the effect of a Judgment Dragon, for example, you'll be able to destroy all other cards in the field and then attack directly with its boosted attack. Although most decks play a whole bunch of monsters that don't have levels, and the ones that do probably don't have effects that can activate as easily as a copied effect of Judgment Dragon. So it's a pretty niche effect that hardly ever comes into play. The fact that it's available, on top of its great fusion materials and having an excellent floating effect, just makes this card one of the best Super Poly targets in the game, and is arguably better than the number 1 spot, so it could really go either way. And at number 1, we have Mudragon of the Swamp. This card's fusion materials are any 2 monsters who have the same attribute, but different types. So this card is live much more often than pretty much every single other card on this list, without any other kind of setup, because of just how versatile those 2 monsters are. A vast majority of decks play a whole bunch of extra deck monsters who have a wide range of attributes and types, though it's only a matter of time before your opponent matches 2 attributes, but has 2 different types on the board, which allows you to bring out Mudragon of the Swamp in order to stop them. Or you could just bring out one of your own monsters, and Super Poly one of your opponent's problem boss monsters based on whichever monster you brought out, to share an attribute but have different types. Mudragon of the Swamp is probably the most versatile Super Poly target, and if you only have room to play 1 card in your extra deck as a target for Super Polymerization, you'll cover the widest range of decks with Mudragon's materials than any of the other cards on this list. And this card also has a decent effect, where your opponent cannot target this card or other monsters in the field that have the same attribute as this card. And this card has a quick effect where it can change its attribute to any other once per turn. So if you're playing a deck that has a whole bunch of dark attribute monsters, for example, and you don't want your opponent to negate your effects with Infinite Impermanence or Effect Veiler, you could bring this card out, change its attribute to dark in order to protect yourself from hand traps for the rest of the turn. It can also be used as an instant fusion target, since it's level 5 or lower, for the same effect of protecting you from targeted effects for a turn. This is one of the few cards on this list that is both an excellent Super Poly target and one of the best instant fusion targets as well. And since instant fusion is a heavily played card too, noted by the fact that it recently got limited to 1 copy for being too good, makes Mudragon take the number 1 spot on this list. Although it's very easy to make arguments that Starving Venom Fusion Dragon is better because of how prevalent dark attribute monsters are in the metagame, or even the new Earth Golem Ignister, but Mudragon is really good against rogue decks, in addition to meta decks, which I think barely edges it out to the top. Alright, and that's the list. If you think there's any other Super Poly targets that are better than the ones on the list, I'd love to hear about them, as well as ideas for future videos just like this one down in the comments. And did you know, only about 31% of people who watch these videos are subscribed to the channel?